In a quiet neighborhood of Santa Monica, there stands a house with a modest yet timeless charm. Weathered shingles and an ivy-covered facade give the home an air of mystery, as if it has witnessed generations of history unfold. The locals call it the Walter Huston House, named after the celebrated actor of the early 20th century, who once lived there. It started subtly, barely noticeable. Visitors and residents alike reported a peculiar sensation upon entering the house. A sudden warmth, as though a room was alive with invisible company. Then came the sounds. On certain nights, often when the air carried the salty tang of the ocean breeze, the faint strains of an antique gramophone would drift through the halls. The melody was always the same, an old jazz tune from the 1930s, upbeat and lively, as if pulled straight from the golden age of Hollywood. But the gramophone was not the only thing. Sometimes, the music would be accompanied by laughter, a rich, infectious baritone that filled the house. It was the kind of laughter that could spark a smile even in the most somber soul. Those who heard it said it felt familiar, comforting, as though the sound was more memory than noise. Local legend tied the phenomena to Walter Huston himself, the charismatic actor whose presence dominated both stage and screen. Known for his hearty laugh and magnetic personality, Huston had been a larger-than-life figure in his time. Though he passed away in 1950, the house he once called home seemed reluctant to let go of his spirit. One evening, a curious skeptic named Daniel decided to test the tales. Armed with a portable recorder and a deep-seated determination to debunk the stories, he spent the night in the house. Hours passed uneventfully, and Daniel began to feel vindicated. But just as he was preparing to leave, the unmistakable crackle of a gramophone needle echoed through the parlor. The music started soft at first, then growing louder. Before Daniel could react, the laughter came. It was booming, joyous, and impossibly close, as though the source was standing right behind him. Heart pounding, Daniel spun around, only to find the room empty. The recorder, however, captured everything. When he played back the audio, the music and laughter were clear as day, sending chills down the spines of all who heard it. Daniel left the house that night, a skeptic no more. Over the years, countless others have claimed their own experiences in the Walter Huston house. Some say they've seen fleeting shadows dancing along the walls. Others describe the sensation of a hand on their shoulder, as if someone were standing beside them, laughing along with the echoes of a bygone era. Whether the occurrences are the playful spirit of Walter Huston himself or merely the echoes of a lively past, the house has become a cherished part of Santa Monica lore, a place where Hollywood's golden age refuses to fade, and where joy, pure, unfiltered joy lingers, carried on the notes of an old gramophone and the sound of unforgettable laughter. Not long after Daniel's eerie encounter, the story of the Walter Huston house spread like wildfire. Paranormal enthusiasts, historians, and even curious tourists began flocking to the property, each hoping for a brush with the unexplained. Some left disappointed, experiencing nothing but the creaks and groans of an old house. Others, however, would leave forever changed, their stories adding layers to the house's already enigmatic reputation. One such visitor was Clara, a young music historian who had long been fascinated by early 20th century jazz and its ties to Hollywood. Armed with a vintage gramophone needle and a stack of records she believed might match the mysterious tune heard in the house, Clara sought to recreate the music and perhaps lure whatever or whoever was responsible for the sounds. It was a rainy evening when Clara arrived, her records carefully tucked under her arm. The house seemed to pulse with its own life as she entered, the sound of raindrops blending with the faint hum of an unseen presence. Setting up her equipment in the parlor, she selected a record with trembling hands and lowered the needle. The room filled with the same jazzy melody others had described, cheerful yet hauntingly out of place in the modern world. Clara sat quietly, listening, waiting. For a time, nothing happened. But then, as the final notes faded into the heavy silence, she heard it, the laughter. It was closer than she'd expected, not coming from the room but somewhere deeper in the house, faint but undeniably real. Determined, Clara followed the sound, her heart racing as she moved through the dimly lit corridors. The laughter grew louder, now mingled with muffled voices, as though a lively conversation were taking place just out of sight. She reached the base of the staircase and froze. The air seemed heavier here, the kind of oppressive stillness that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. Clara could swear she smelled cigar smoke, rich and pungent, though the air was clear. Slowly, she ascended the steps, each creak of the old wood amplifying her unease. At the top of the stairs, she found herself standing before a door she hadn't noticed earlier. It was slightly ajar, a faint glow spilling through the crack as the voices inside rose and fell in lively conversation. Clara pushed the door open, her breath catching in her throat. The room beyond was unlike any part of the house she'd seen before. It was warm, filled with golden light, and furnished in a style that could only belong to the 1930s. A man in a crisp suit leaned against a piano, cigarette in hand, while others laughed and clinked glasses. In the center of it all stood a figure Clara instantly recognized not from personal memory, but from the black and white photographs that adorned countless books and articles about old Hollywood. Walter Huston. He was laughing, his head thrown back, his entire presence radiating a kind of effortless charisma. The room seemed alive, vibrant, untouched by time. Clara's pulse quickened as she stepped inside, her instincts torn between awe and a deep, inexplicable fear. As if sensing her presence, Huston turned his gaze toward her, his smile widening. He raised his glass in a toast, his laughter reverberating through the room. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the scene vanished. Clara found herself standing alone in the empty room, her records clutched tightly in her hands. The only evidence of what she'd seen was the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering in the air. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Clara barely slept that night. Her mind reeled with the vivid image of the golden-lit room, the laughter, and the figure of Walter Huston staring directly at her. She replayed every detail over and over, searching for some rational explanation, but none came. By morning, she resolved to dig deeper into the house's history. She began her research at the Santa Monica Historical Society. The curator, an elderly man named Mr. Pettigrew, listened intently as Clara recounted her experience. His face grew serious as she spoke, and when she finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. "You're not the first to see something in that house," he finally said, his voice low. Mr. Pettigrew pulled a dusty ledger from a shelf and flipped through its brittle pages. "This house has stories going back to before Huston's time. It was built in the late 1800s by a man named Elias Abernathy. He was a recluse, an inventor of sorts, and some say he dabbled in, well, let's call them unconventional sciences. After his disappearance, the house passed through many hands, but strange happenings were always reported: voices, music, shadows." He paused, running a finger down a faded newspaper clipping. When Huston moved in, he was fascinated by the house's history. He even claimed to have found some of Abernathy's old journals hidden in a false wall. But those journals vanished after Huston's death, and no one has seen them since. Clara's pulse quickened. Journals? What kind of journals? Mr. Pettigrew hesitated. "Accounts of experiments," he said slowly. "Abernathy believed he could record moments in time, memories, emotions into the very fabric of the space around him. The house, he claimed, was his greatest work. If Huston found those journals, it might explain why his presence seems imprinted there." Clara's mind raced. Could the house be more than just haunted? Was it possible that the laughter, the music, the golden-lit room were fragments of a memory, trapped and replaying like a recording? If so, why had she been able to interact with it? Driven by these questions, Clara returned to the house that evening. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ivy-covered walls as she stepped inside, clutching a flashlight and a notebook. This time, she was determined to explore every corner. Hours passed as she combed through the house, meticulously tapping on walls and searching for any sign of a hidden compartment or passage. Frustration began to creep in when, in the basement, her flashlight beam caught something odd. A small gap between the bricks in the far wall. Her heart pounded as she ran her fingers along the seam, pressing against the wall until, with a faint click, a panel swung open. Behind it lay a narrow alcove, filled with dust and cobwebs. Inside, resting on a small wooden shelf, was a leather-bound journal, its edges frayed with age. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with Abernathy's cramped handwriting, sketches of strange devices, and detailed accounts of his experiments. But what struck her most were the last entries, written in a hurried scrawl. Something is wrong. The recordings are no longer stable. They bleed into each other. Faces I do not recognize. Voices that do not belong. If this persists, I fear I will lose myself in the echoes. Clara turned the page, but the journal ended abruptly, the final sheet torn out. As she stood there, absorbing the implications, the familiar strains of the gramophone began to play upstairs. Only this time it wasn't faint or distant. It was loud, insistent, as if beckoning her. Clara looked up toward the ceiling, the music seeming to vibrate through the very walls. Her flashlight flickered, then died, plunging her into darkness. She felt the air shift around her, heavy and charged, as a voice, not laughter this time, but a whisper, brushed against her ear. "Help me!" The music stopped, leaving a deafening silence. Clara's breath hitched as she realized the voice hadn't come from the house. It had come from within her. Clara stood frozen in the dark, her pulse hammering in her ears. The whisper, the plea, seemed to reverberate through her mind, not fading but embedding itself deeper with every passing second. The silence around her felt suffocating, as though the house itself were holding its breath. She clutched the journal tightly, her knuckles white against the aged leather. Something told her she couldn't leave now, not after what she'd just heard. Gritting her teeth, she forced herself to move, climbing the creaky basement stairs back to the parlor. The room felt different. The air shimmered faintly, as though a thin veil of heat hung just beyond the edge of her vision. The gramophone sat in its usual corner, silent and dusty, yet it exuded an odd energy, like it was waiting. Without thinking, Clara approached it and placed her hand on the crank. The moment she began to turn it, the room changed. The walls seemed to breathe, their texture shifting into something smoother, glossier. The soft flicker of electric light transformed into the golden glow of oil lamps. The faint scent of cigar smoke returned, stronger this time, mingling with the faint aroma of aged wood and polished brass. Clara blinked, her heart pounding, as she realized she was no longer alone. Figures began to appear, faint at first, like reflections on rippling water. They solidified slowly, a woman in an elegant gown laughing behind a jeweled cigarette holder, a man in a sharp three-piece suit adjusting his tie as he leaned against the piano. The room came alive with muted conversation and the soft clinking of glasses, as though she'd been dropped into a scene from the past. And then, there he was again, Walter Huston, his presence commanding the space as naturally as breathing. He moved with ease among the others, laughing and gesturing animatedly. But this time, Clara noticed something strange. His expression, though joyful, seemed strained, as though some part of him was aware of the charade and longed to escape it. Before she could call out, Houston's eyes met hers. His smile faltered, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to ripple again, the edges of the scene wavering like a disturbed reflection in a pond. He took a step toward her, his voice rising above the din. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his tone urgent. Clara's throat tightened. "What is this? What's happening?" Houston's face twisted, a mix of frustration and sorrow. "The echoes, they trap us. They pull us back, replay us. I tried to stop it, but Abernathy's work, it's too strong." "What do you mean?" Clara pressed, clutching the journal. "What does the house want?" Houston's gaze flicked to the journal in her hands, his expression darkening. "It doesn't want. It is, and it's breaking. You have to." The gramophone screeched, a sharp, metallic sound that made Clara wince. The golden-lit room fractured, fragments of the scene splitting apart like shards of glass. Houston's form flickered, his voice growing faint as the world around them collapsed. "Find the last page," he shouted, his words barely audible. "It's the key." and then he was gone. Clara stumbled back, her surroundings snapping back to the present with a jarring suddenness. The house was silent again, its shadows long and still. She looked down at the journal, her hands trembling. The missing page, it had to be somewhere in the house. The whisper came again, faint and desperate. "Help me." But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, layered like faint echoes, were other voices, some pleading, some laughing, some screaming. The walls around her seemed to pulse faintly, as though the house itself was alive, struggling to contain something vast and unknowable. Clara knew she had to find that missing page. But the house was changing, shifting. And as she stood there, she realized with growing dread that whatever she was searching for wasn't just hidden, it was protected. Clara gripped the journal tightly, her resolve hardening despite the growing dread curling in her chest. She could feel it now. The house seemed aware of her intentions. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows carried an ominous weight. Yet she pressed on, retracing her steps, determined to uncover the missing page. Her search brought her to the study, a room she'd initially overlooked. Dust motes danced in the moonlight streaming through the tall windows, and the air was thick with the smell of old paper and varnish. The large oak desk in the center of the room drew her attention. Its surface was cluttered with scattered papers, an inkwell, and a brass candlestick. Clara began opening drawers, rifling through their contents with mounting urgency. Letters, faded photographs, and brittle receipts offered no clues. Then, in the deepest drawer, she found a leather pouch tied with a fraying cord. She untied it with trembling fingers, revealing a single sheet of aged paper, folded neatly and yellowed with time. The missing page. As she unfolded it, the air in the room grew heavier, almost suffocating. The words scrawled on the page were in Abernathy's handwriting, frantic and uneven. To sever the echoes, the tether must be broken. The house feeds on the resonance, looping what it holds. Destroy the core, my device, lest the echoes consume all. Beneath the warning was a crude diagram of a machine, its parts labeled with cryptic notations. Clara's mind raced. If Abernathy's device was the core he spoke of, it had to still be in the house, hidden somewhere deep. The basement. The moment she turned toward the door, the house reacted. The study's walls groaned, and the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the room, swirling like living things. A cold wind blew through, carrying whispers, dozens of voices, overlapping and growing louder. Clara clutched the journal and the page, shouting over the cacophony. "I know what you are. I'll end this." The whispers turned to guttural moans, and the room began to distort, the walls warping and bending inward. Clara's heart pounded, but she refused to yield. She ran to the window, threw it open, and climbed out onto the ledge. The stormy night air hit her like a slap, but it was a welcome reprieve from the oppressive energy inside. She made her way back to the basement, every step charged with a sense of inevitability. The gramophone began playing again as she descended, its tune warped and discordant. At the far end of the basement, where she'd found the hidden alcove, the wall now stood slightly ajar, revealing a narrow passage she hadn't noticed before. Clara stepped inside. The air was colder here, sharp and metallic. The passage led to a small chamber, where a strange machine sat in the center of the room. It was an amalgam of brass, copper, and glass, its surfaces etched with runes and strange symbols. The machine pulsed faintly, its gears turning ever so slightly, as though alive. She approached it, Abernathy's journal in hand, her fingers tracing the parts described in the diagram. The device seemed to hum in recognition, its vibrations intensifying as she drew closer. Clara hesitated. Destroying the device would end the echoes, but would it also erase them, the laughter, the music, the fleeting glimpses of joy, the spirits tied to the house? She felt Huston's gaze in her memory, his urgent plea ringing in her ears. "You have to," she whispered to herself. With trembling hands, Clara grabbed a nearby iron rod and swung it into the device. Sparks flew, and the hum turned into a piercing wail. She struck it again, and the machine shuddered, its components tearing apart. The room seemed to collapse inward, the air vibrating violently. The house roared in protest, the voices rising in a deafening crescendo. Shadows swirled around her, clawing at the edges of her vision. But Clara didn't stop. With one final swing, the machine exploded in a burst of light, throwing her to the ground. When she opened her eyes, the silence was absolute. The basement was still. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. Clara sat up, her head spinning. The journal lay nearby, its pages now blank, as though the house had drained it of its secrets. As she climbed back upstairs, the house felt lighter. The air no longer pressed down on her, and the faint scent of cigar smoke was gone. She stood in the parlor, looking around one last time. The gramophone was silent. And then, faintly, she heard it. A single warm laugh, fading into nothing. Clara smiled through her tears. The house was finally free. And so was Walter Huston. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.